Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Once Upon a Tome, The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller, by Oliver Darkshire. Narrated by Oliver Darkshire.
40. You married a writer, so history will say you suffered. And you married a man, so history will say we were roommates. And for my mother, who I think we can finally admit loves me best of all her children. A note from the author's supervisor. Sotheran's is very old. We have been heaving around the world since 1761, so the arrival of something as trivial as the internet was like a fly landing on the hide of a brachiosaur. One afternoon in 2012, we decided to open a Twitter account, and once in a while someone would tweet about the hilarious antics of a guardsman in 1874, and the rest of the time we forgot about it. No one really noticed Oliver slowly taking it over. I first became aware that he was tweeting in late 2018, when he said something like, "Oh, I've sent this tweet, I think we might get a complaint." As a new managing director, I thought this was something I ought to get to know about, so I accessed our Twitter account. I was instantly agog. We had gone from about 4 followers to 1,000. There were messages about swords, and tuna, and demons that apparently lived in our cellars. There were cries from the heart, and jokes about owls. There was even some stuff about books. I don't think we did receive a complaint about the tweet, but I did think I should keep an eye on things, just so I could stay in touch with the parallel universe that was being created. Oliver has spun a bizarre and extemporized multiverse out of the mundane reality of selling antiquarian books. Every now and then, a broken statue of our reality emerges through the dreamscape, and sometimes Oliver engages with an urgent issue that pierces through all fantasy. But mostly he follows his whim and fancy to bring a weirdly augmented Sotheran's to the world. I usually look after the Twitter feed when Oliver is on holiday, and it is like stepping into a fever dream from which I emerge exhilarated and sweaty, as if I have completed a level of Super Mario from within the screen. My word, it's popular though. We have getting on 40,000 followers at the time of writing, which is phenomenal for an antiquarian bookseller, and shows not only the level of interest in the world of books, but also Oliver's ability to entertain and enlighten a whole load of people we would not otherwise have reached. This book, which came about because of a Twitter feed, is a natural progression, a chance to carve a physical Rushmore from the digital mountain. This whole crossover between the real and the virtual is, by the way, very uncomfortable for an antique bookseller. I still feel like we should be using quills. But we can't deny that the boundaries are shifting, and turning a bricks-and-mortar bookshop into a digital universe, into a physical book, feels very modern. But then again, so does the internal combustion engine. So here you are, dear reader. Delve in, make discoveries, and meet some of the other Sotheranians who occupy our unique space. Not every event occurred exactly as described, and some of the characters are conflations and chimeras. And of course, in my modesty, I had to veto the entire 20-page section devoted to Oliver's tribute to me as the most handsome, musically gifted, and inspired boss in any possible universe. But apart from that, this is all true-ish. Chris Saunders, Managing Director, Sotheran's, London, October 2022. Introduction. The Bookseller's Apprentice. It was the A-board that gave the game away in the end. It had lost one of the stubby legs holding it upright, a victim, no doubt, of some long-forgotten street accident, and so was teetering on 3. The paint had peeled off in large strips, but I could still make out most of the name, Henry Sotheran Ltd, Fine Books and Prints. I had walked past twice before I'd found it, quietly tucked away on a side street known for being completely unknown. Sackville Street had a reputation for being a commercial dead end, despite being attached like a vestigial tail to Piccadilly and Regent Street, both of which bustle with umbrellas and car horns from dawn to dusk. People say businesses go to Sackville Street to die, which might explain the slightly unnerving air as I approached on that cold November morning. I was in Sackville Street that day to interview for a job. People often ask how one gets a job at a bookshop like Sotheran's. Young and adrift in London, like many of my contemporaries, I spent my days vainly grasping at shadowy career prospects, which always seemed to slip through my fingers at the last minute. In a particularly dark moment, when I drifted into some far corner of the internet on my search, I saw an advertisement for a bookshop seeking an apprentice. It wasn't a particularly good advertisement. The pay was Victorian, the expected duties nebulous, and the whole thing had an air of desperation about it. More comfortingly, however, no prior experience was necessary, and within a day I'd received a call asking me to attend an interview with the manager. On the day of the interview, I was early. In the days before I became involved in books, I frequently was. Striding confidently out the double door, I gave it a hearty push, the kind of push someone might make who you would hire on the spot. It didn't move, instead rattling about noisily. I yanked it. By this point, I could see shadowy figures inside staring icily at my abortive entry attempts, but I persevered. Pushing the right-hand door, I stumbled inside, mumbling a half-hearted apology, which was swallowed up by the diorama stretching out before me. It's the smell that hits you first. Velour. There's something wistful about old books when they're gathered in one place. They have a faintly unsatisfied smell, as if they're all distantly aware that they've missed their chance to be a worldwide smash hit. I looked around at the colourful shelves of books, tables piled high with suspicious articles, crooked furniture, and misplaced literary paraphernalia. You don't think of the word colourful when you envision an old bookstore, but it's true of all the ones I know. The pillars holding the creaking roof aloft blocked out a full view of the shop floor, which only appeared accessible in its furthest reaches by dodging between dangerously stacked piles of classic literature. People milled about in the shadows, doors creaking open and closed. The only sounds were the curmudgeonly groaning of cases, the shuffling of feet, and a phone bleeping unanswered somewhere in the dark. I'm not quite sure how long I stood there taking it all in. Eventually, I was saved from myself by a gregarious man with a mop of silver hair and a bad back who it transpired was Andrew, the manager. To this day, I have never met anyone with quite a talent for defusing an uncomfortable situation. I've seen people walk in ready to burn the shop to the ground, and 3 minutes with Andrew had them agreeing to dinner at some later point, buying a book, and leaving with a baffled expression as if they couldn't quite remember why they came into the shop in the first place. Sotheran's is a small place, as I would come to find out, and if I'd thought the manager would be a far-off and unapproachable figure, I was quickly disabused of that notion. I was led down the grand stairs in the middle of the shop to the lower floor, and through the print gallery, filled with posters, illustrations, and other maddeningly distracting wonders. We breezed past them into a side room crammed with bibliographic reference books. Andrew gave me a rather apologetic look as he tried, with limited success, to extract 2 chairs from the debris. The door closed and everything fell silent. Cramped bookshelves muffle noise from outside, a strange effect which also helps insulate the shop from the traffic on surrounding roads. If you're used to working or living in any large city, and especially one like London, you know that the background hum of cars and engines seeps into your soul. There are very few places where you can escape from the constant muttering of the streets. But bookshops are one of them. Perched on chairs in the tiny room, there was barely space for both of us to sit, and Andrew seemed to realize this as he inched a little further back into a stack of old book-selling magazines. This, he explained, was the catalogue room. Its purpose, he confessed, roughly translated to, "This is where we put things when there is nowhere else for them to go." Several months into my fruitless London job search, this felt oddly apt. Part of Andrew's knack for putting people at ease was his eagle eye for reading people from a distance. It's a prerequisite for any decent bookseller, really, but Andrew was, and remains, the expert. After no more than 10 seconds sizing me up, he spent the rest of the interview idly chatting about the problems the shop had faced finding reliable new staff in recent years. It transpired, or so he confessed as I sat transfixed by this unexpected frankness, that each year the shop had hired some bright young thing, a star on the rise with degrees and qualifications to match, thinking themselves to have secured the perfect bookseller. Alas, in each case, the prodigy lasted about 6 months, before buggering off into the stratosphere of the art world, where wages, and proximity to daylight, were in greater abundance. Andrew was looking for something different this time. He was looking for someone who wanted to stay, who was in it for the long haul. The staff, he explained, were getting whiplash from learning one new name a year, and it was all very inconvenient. He laid out the terms. The hired apprentice would stay on for at least 2 years under a training scheme to transform them into a competent antiquarian bookseller, at which point the company hoped they would become a full-time member of staff. I'll admit to you, listener, that I nodded like a performing seal. It's true that the wages for an apprentice bookseller seem to have been frozen around when the old curiosity shop opened for business in 1840, but it was better than the little to which I'd become accustomed. More than that, compared to my recurring nightmare of cowering miserably in a cubicle, the job seemed like a lifeline, even if I couldn't move without threatening to dislodge some precariously situated and priceless relic of company history. The interview was over, almost as soon as it began. I remember thinking I must have botched the whole thing terribly, because we were in and out before I really had time to process what was happening. I was sent home with a cheery smile and a "we'll be in touch in a few days." My heart sank. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, I received a call offering me the job. I will never be sure why. I have a small suspicion that they threw darts at a wheel of fortune, or simply got me confused with someone else and never found a good moment to correct the mistake. Regardless, a few days later I was walking back up to the double doors in a rather battered old suit with a new sense of purpose. It's funny, thinking back, that my journey started as simply as this. A half-hearted advertisement stumbled across online, a furtive interview, a quick polish of the shoes, never repeated, and suddenly I was a rare bookseller. Part 1. Antiquarian and General. A primer on the art of bookselling, general occurrences, confessions, and misapprehensions of the literary kind. It is amazing how high a proportion of our stock is not actually books. Tradition has it that the literature is lumped in with miscellaneous nonsense and general bric-a-brac on the shelves at Sotheran's, under a department called Antiquarian and General. A polite way of saying that no one really knows what else to do with it. As an apprentice with no skills, and later in my career as a bookseller with no skills, I was expected to help out with the sprawling department, which encompasses much of the strangeness Sotheran's has to offer. You never know quite what you'll find in Antiquarian and General. Fortunately for me, it also contains everything which the average person might be looking for. You want an Austen? Wonderful. It's probably over there near the bust of Prince Albert, in the cabinet above some rather ugly Byron would never been able to shift. In one corner, roosting on a rickety stool and clutching a tankard of tea, is James. Chapter 1. James. If I thought my interview at the shop had given me an idea of what to expect from my colleagues, I was mistaken. Until I turned up at the shop for my first day of work, the manager Andrew was the only colleague I'd met. His calm, sanguine attitude was innately soothing. He remains in my mind the archetype of what it means to work in antiquarian books, inhabiting an effortless serenity in the face of chaos that I have always struggled to emulate. This sublime state of being, I feel, was perhaps cultivated by keeping potential sources of stress, such as a bumbling apprentice, at arm's length. And so it transpired that I was passed on to James for training. If Andrew was the heart that quietly, patiently kept blood pumping around the shop, then James was the spine that kept it upright. Tall and slightly crooked, he had the air of a scarecrow that had been left out in the sun for too long. From his paper-strewn desk in a dimly lit corner of the shop, he watched over the books, guarding them with a suspender-clad perspicacity cultivated over many years to drive away shoplifters, ne'er-do-wells, and birds of ill omen. I spent much of my first year under James's tutelage, and in many ways he encapsulated something of an older time. It might seem impertinent to describe him as a fossil, but his endless, loving repairs in the shop left an imprint on the place, and, I suppose, eventually it shaped him in return. I use the word repairs generously, because his well-meaning efforts rarely resulted in the offending door, shelf, or case functioning in the same way after he had finished fixing it. James was a handyman of the self-taught variety, and the rest of the staff took the rather sensible position that it is rarely a good idea to argue overlong with a man who uses a hammer to solve most of his problems. Loping around like a grizzled but bookish wolf, he handled all the day-to-day mundane affairs of the shop. Thus, my apprenticeship fell into his hands, in the same way as anything else no one really wanted to deal with. It came to my attention several years into my role that no one in the shop, apart from James, knew where the rubbish went, who took it anywhere, or what happened to it. As far as anyone was concerned, it just vanished. It transpired that James didn't want anyone to know, for reasons which will become apparent. Supposedly, James had been apprenticed as a boat builder, not at a dockyard. The distinction was oddly important to him, before he wandered into Henry Sotheran Ltd one day and never left. Either way, everything he knew, and he knew everything, was the result of being at the bookshop from mid-morning until dusk each day for decades. In hindsight, I'm very grateful I had him looking out for me during those first few months, but I didn't really have time for feelings of gratitude, as they placed me at a munchkin-sized desk in front of the double doors. It was explained to me that the desk had been designed for Victorian ladies, not for the lumbering 6 feet of clumsiness which now sat behind it, meaning I essentially had to ride the wretched thing side-saddle for years. I have, for various reasons, spent most of my bookselling career behind desks that are far too small for me, but this very first desk I resented most of all. A few days passed peaceably in the shop, sat at my tiny desk, before I realized I hadn't really done anything. I was used to a busy environment. My previous job was doing paperwork at a legal firm. I was dreadfully bad at that, and fled the situation before they could fire me, but the change of pace was jarring. At Sotheran's, much to my amazement, the phone didn't really ring at all, sometimes for hours. People sat quietly at their desks, working on something peculiar and arcane which I couldn't pretend to understand. Sometimes people wandered in, and James would swoop down from the rafters to direct them to the right shelves. Andrew, the manager, sat at the desk adjacent to me, occasionally kindly asking if I was doing all right. Yes, I was doing all right, I would confirm, too scared to mention that I wasn't sure what I was supposed to be doing. Eventually, it dawned on me that if I didn't ask for something to do, my ossified remains might eventually be found cradling a tiny desk in my arms by a team of confused archaeologists. No sooner, however, had the thought entered my mind than James manifested from a shadowy enclave with a box of books. I was to be taught cataloguing. At the time, I was baffled by the events unfolding before me, having no idea at all what was meant by cataloguing, even if I was glad to have something to do. The task seemed to involve describing the books using odd words, and it was a much better pastime than sitting there twiddling my thumbs. The books I was being asked to handle were not rare books, but things James had picked up on his many attempts to sneak second-hand books into the shop. As a new recruit in a shop full of mysterious colleagues, whose workings I didn't really understand, this was perfect teaching material, stuff I could afford to get vastly wrong without any real consequence. It spoke to a schism amongst staff, however, about what it means to be an antiquarian bookseller. Though they might all seem the same at a glance, second-hand books are not always rare books, and rare books are not always antiquarian books. James was a bookseller who, despite his expertise in all things book-related, wanted to sell second-hand books. He enjoyed selling £10 copies of anything he could find in a car boot sale or a cellar, or retrieved from the bin of a publisher's remainder stock to anyone who walked in off the street. He had no interest in computers, no interest in cataloguing rare books, and he marked up everything in a manner that wasn't technically criminal, but probably should have been. It was a book-selling model that harked back to days gone by when people would, I hear, walk in off the street and depart with piles of books loaded onto their carriage. James was very fond of waxing lyrical about the days when people were less picky. He considered the modern and technological aspects of bookselling to be an extravagant conceit. If he had to sit on a stack of books for 10 years before they sold, then so be it. A book will find its proper owner in due course. The true spirit of book buying, as far as he was concerned, did not debase itself with trivialities like, "What will I eat later?" or "How will I pay my rent?" Unlike many of the other staff who preferred to deal in rare items worth larger sums of money, delivering them safely into the hands of enthusiastic collectors and prestigious institutions, James just wanted to sell books. Any books. And so each day he would arrive on his creaking bicycle, trussed up with another bulging crate of second-hand whodunits or 1990s train guides, and lug them inside. My apprenticeship served as something of a laundering scheme for these books. James would pass them to me to teach me about them, and then spirit them away into the back of the shop before Andrew could say, "Where are you taking all those hideous books? Get back here this instant." Chapter 2. Browsers and dilettantes. I think it's important to pause for a moment and explain that antiquarian booksellers have a complex relationship with their customers. I came into bookselling completely unprepared, which is perhaps a mercy because I might otherwise have fled in the opposite direction without ever looking back. I'm rather generously using the word customer here, in the absence of a better term, to describe anyone who darkens our threshold. In truth, only a fraction of the people who enter an antiquarian bookshop have any intention of purchasing a book. Now, I'm not a gregarious person by nature. I was the kind of toddler who was told they needed to play more with the other children, and the kind of teenager who spent their time being told that if they didn't have anything nice to say to other people, then they should leave them alone. My mother has never let me forget the occasion on which a 4-year-old Oliver, on being told he needed to stop sitting by himself, took the opportunity to stand up and show his arse to the poor teacher in question. Alas, the punishment, being sent to the reading corner, was not altogether discouraging. There are very few job positions open for a 20-year-old with a bad attitude and no higher education, and unfortunately almost all of these involve dealing with the general public in one manner or another. Looking back, I think part of what attracted me to the world of rare books was the fanciful, naive idea that it might involve fewer uncomfortable encounters with strangers than a supermarket kiosk or vagrancy. When you're watching the shop floor of an antiquarian bookshop, there's usually a fairly steady trickle of people gingerly entering from the street throughout the day. Young, old, bespectacled, tattooed. The vast majority are going to wander around looking haunted or asking questions, and a small number are going to buy books. Sadly, it really is impossible to tell one from the other at a glance. So everyone has to be treated as if they might suddenly whip out a gigantic bag of gold bars and purchase the place. Equally possible is that some disreputable-looking wanderer might surprise you with a Gutenberg Bible. There's really no way of knowing what's about to happen in any given moment. When I took up my place behind the front desk at Sotheran's, the expectation was that any request from a customer should be politely entertained where possible. It was one of the stipulations laid out in the Sotheran staff manual, and James insisted on it. You would often find him poring over a vintage A to Z of London, pointing someone towards an establishment that no longer existed, or unwittingly directing them into a construction zone filled with territorial rats. He would give out umbrellas from our umbrella stand, only remembering, as the customer disappeared into the rain, that the only reason the device in question hadn't been stolen already was that it had a large hole in it. He was a total gentleman and a public menace. It's probably the coziness of a bookshop that leads people to treat it more like a second home or a hotel than a place of business. There's a certain kind of person we see all the time who strides in looking for something which is definitely not a book. Staplers, printers, spoons. They'll trumpet over the threshold, armed with a toothy smile, with a view to finding some generous polymath who can direct them to what they need. It's possible that in other bookstores they do find this kind of help, which would explain the alarming regularity with which people wander in asking for things we clearly don't sell. I printed out solid reams of directions, taught elderly women how Google Maps works. "Oh, so the picture moves, does it? Do another one, I want to see my house." Stood in the street, desperately miming the phrase, "Turn around and go back the way you came," to a gentleman old enough to have witnessed the fall of Carthage, all in a day's work for the common or garden book dealer. Our imagined status as mysterious guardians of all knowledge leads people to treat booksellers as terrestrial genies, spiriting up the answer to any problem from the bottom of our fusty old pockets. A bone of contention for quite some time in the Sotheran's firmament was the dreaded question, traditionally uttered with an apologetic grimace: "Can I use your bathroom?" An innocent request, you might think. Sotheran's has always been blessed with spacious, well-appointed lavatories buried at the back of a shop near the cellars. The casual London shopper is somehow able to sense this from a mile away, and we frequently receive visitors looking to answer the call of nature in an antiquarian retail environment. It took the incident of 2014 for the bathrooms to be sealed off from public use, the particulars of which are not for the faint of heart, and I shall spare you the grisly details. Chapter 3. Collectors. Given the general irritation that most casual customers pose, you might wonder why booksellers ever open their doors at all. The reason is collectors. Like an ugly duckling morphing into a golden goose, sometimes a casual browser will evolve into a book collector. It's impossible to say what catalyzes this change. Some primal magpie-adjacent urge begins to burn under the surface, and one dark day they make a simple choice whence there is no return. They purchase an old book. It might seem innocuous, but this is the first in 39 ineluctable steps towards becoming a 90-year-old hermit in a house full of books, complaining that your ungrateful children do not appreciate your library. Long sleepless nights as a bookseller are spent trying to figure out what causes the transformation from one state to another, but the mystery as yet remains unsolved. Be that as it may, collectors provide the vast majority of bookshop revenue because they are absolutely insatiable. Under the banner of book collector, you'll find a host of strange and wonderful people united by their obsession with acquiring and sitting on a hoard of papery treasures. Some of them make a point of coming in regularly, some communicate by mail only, and some like to send delegates from overseas, carrying a list of cryptic instructions to be carried out over a 6-day period. They will often have very specific interests and needs, and if you want to retain their custom, then you'll need to remember what they are, what books are in their collection already, and a host of other details. Then, when they appear, you manifest relevant items out of thin air with a flourish, a behavior which appears to the onlooker to derive from extrasensory perception, but actually originates in decades of careful, hypervigilant note-taking. There are two kinds of collector you really have to watch out for. Untrained observers think there are more, but there's really only two. Smaugs, like their namesake, like to amass vast lairs full of precious items. They are sometimes wealthy, but most are comfortably situated enough to spread their collecting habits over many areas. The main quality they share is that of the polymath. One subject area is not enough, when they could have 50. They may not know exactly what is in their collection, but they'd rather buy 3 copies than risk missing out. As you can imagine, this makes booksellers very happy to see them, because you can be sure that no matter what strange book you have waiting on the shelves, a Smaug will appreciate it. They will never snub you for suggesting a book on garderobes. When they finally pass on or dispense with their library, their dragon hoard is released back into the bookselling world in a great flood, inciting a minor gold rush for the most precious objects. Draculas have one very specific interest that sustains them, and their collecting habits are centered around it. Rare plants, Gothic table decorations, calligraphy. They'll procure and sequester anything in that line of scholarship, and your chances of selling them a book are directly proportional to how close you can make it look to their field of interest. You have to invite them over the threshold with tempting acquisitions, but a relationship can be quite rewarding, as you'll rarely find anyone quite as devoted to their area of specialism. Furthermore, if you need to pick someone's brains, they're usually very happy to share their knowledge. Some will even lend you books, or invite you over to look at a new find. Some of our closest relationships with clients are with this kind of specialized collector, cultivated over decades. Every book collector comes under one of those two banners, and the smart book collector learns to identify them as quickly as possible. If you keep offering a Dracula books outside their current fixation, they will vanish into the night and find another bookseller who better understands their tastes. And if you offer a Smaug only a limited, curated selection of content, they'll quickly get bored, or worse, stop spending money. Managing the expectations and desires of collectors is the heart of the rare book business.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?